Okay, thank you. Welcome. My name is Kate McCusker. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for the Oregon Department of State Lands, and I will be your moderator and public hearings officer for today's meeting. Thank you for taking the time to join us in learning more about the department's proposed update to our 10-year plan managing Oregon's lands that benefit the Common School Fund. I'm going to go over briefly how to provide public comment and today's agenda, and then we'll get started with the presentation. Next. Today, Department's Real Property Specialist Brian Cochran will give an overview of the asset management plan, including some background, development timeline, and an introduction of the plan sections. Following his presentation, we'll have time for a few questions. And if you have a question about what's being presented, please jot that question down. And I think you can also submit that at any time using the Q&A button on the meeting. But you can also just wait until after the presentation too. And then following the question and answer portion, the remaining time will be hearing from all of you for the public hearing session. Next. I've got a preview of how to provide spoken comments up on the screen, but I'll actually be reviewing those guidelines in more detail later on when it comes to the public hearing portion of today. But I just wanted to give you a little sneak preview. So for those of you, next. For those of you that want to provide written comments, those written comments can be submitted through a few different ways, online, via email, or through the mail anytime between now until Wednesday, April 3rd. And then after, once Brian's presentations starts, I'll actually copy this information into the chat as well, just so you can access that URL easily. Before we begin, just a couple tiny housekeeping notes. Just please keep yourself muted. And then finally, we'll be recording today's public meeting, and we'll make that recording available on the project webpage afterwards, either tomorrow or the next day. So we'll get that up online quickly. We'll also be recording your spoken comments if during today's public hearing portion for consideration in the public review process. And with that, I'll actually hand it over to our presenter, Brian Cochran, for the presentation.
All right, thanks, Kate. Good afternoon. I'm going to start out with a little information about the Department of State Lands. Next slide, please. So the Act of Congress admitting Oregon to the Union in 1859 granted the state nearly 3.4 million acres of land, quote, for the use of schools, unquote. The money from the sale and management of these school lands goes into the Common School Fund, which provides funding for public education since statehood. And by the way, I'm going to use the term school lands a lot in this presentation, but they are also known as constitutional lands or trust lands. The State Land Board, which is the governor, state treasurer, and secretary of state, have the Department of State Lands administer these school lands. The Department of State Lands, or DSL, is considered Oregon's oldest agency. Today, the Department of State Lands manages about 1.5 million acres. The State Land Board has management authority over all department programs. These programs include the Oregon-owned waterways, the South Slough Reserve, Elliott State Research Forest, the regulatory removal and fill law, and the 681,000 acres of school lands. It is these school lands that are the focus of this asset management plan. Next slide, please. So the Real Property Program implements the asset management plan and manages the department's school land statewide. The Real Property work is handled by the staff in the Bend office, and they manage the resources and activities on our school lands, including issuing leases for numerous uses such as grazing. They handle land transactions, land ownership matters, and are also tasked with managing mineral rights for DSL and other state agencies. In 1995, the legislature directed the State Land Board to adopt an asset management plan to guide land management. The previous asset management plan was approved in 2012. This asset management plan will be the fourth version and is anticipated to cover the next 10 years of management. This plan is organized into 5 sections: an introduction, guiding principles, land classifications, action areas, measuring success. There are also some appendices that provide additional background. Next slide, please. All right, timeline. So as this slide shows, we've been working on updating the document for over a year. Our process started with gathering public input through public meetings and one-on-one conversations. The bulk of the process included research and drafting the plan, and the last few months have been in various internal reviews prior to our release of this public draft on March 4th. The public has the opportunity to comment on this draft until April 3rd. All comments received will be carefully reviewed and synthesized into a final document, draft document. We are also planning to have the final version dressed up with photos, multiple maps, and call out details of school lands management as it relates to climate resiliency. From there, we hope to present to the Land Board in June. Fingers crossed. Next slide, please. So throughout the plan, as I've said, the term school lands is used generally to refer to the lands managed under this plan. And most of these lands, about 96% of them, covered in this plan are Oregon's constitutionally dedicated lands for the use of schools. However, 4% of the remaining lands are those lands dedicated to the state land board management by statute. These are known as statutory lands, which are also called non-trust lands. These are not school lands, but these 4% fit well with the other school lands in terms of management. The management of these different types of lands is nearly the same as school lands. The main difference is how revenue is tracked and routed into the common school fund. Management of the statutory lands has additional considerations to the public trust rights of commerce, navigation, fishing, and recreation. This slide shows a photo of Crump Lake in Lake County, which are statutory lands. Crump Lake lands were acquired through the Swamplands Act of 1860, but that is only one example of the various ways statutory lands are acquired. The other pictures are of the Article 8 of the original state constitution, which addresses the school lands, and some examples of deeds that were created from school lands, which bear that school stamp at the top of them, which is interesting history. Next slide, please. So this plan is primarily concerned with management of 7 land classifications. These are agricultural lands, forest lands, ICR lands, which stands for industrial, commercial, and residential lands, mineral lands, rangelands, special stewardship lands, and renewable energy lands, which is a newly created land classification. As you can see on this map, school lands occur throughout the state. We have rangelands on the eastern side of Oregon. We have our larger forest land pieces on the west side. We have most of our ICR lands in central Oregon. But mineral lands are the largest land classification. They're throughout the state, but they include that gray checkerboard seen prominently in southeastern Oregon. They are the subsurface mineral and geothermal rights that were commonly retained when surface lands were exchanged or sold. Our school lands. Next slide, please. This slide is a graphic showing the proportions of these different land classifications. So you can see 53% are mineral lands, 43% are range lands, which are the bulk of our school lands. What's left are 3% are forest lands, and the remaining land classifications are each under 1%. There are no renewable energy lands created yet. For each of these 7 land classifications, the plan covers details on land characteristics, management requirements, performance expectations, and opportunity considerations for each classification. Next slide, please. All right, action areas. The next few slides, I'm going to go over the action areas, which can be thought of as the plan's goals. There are 12 action areas summarized on this slide. These actions are a lot to unpack in a short presentation, but they are focused on increasing efficiency, increasing opportunities, increasing land use, and growing partnerships. The intention of these action areas is managing school lands to create and increase the Common School Fund to better fund public education. Some of these action areas include modernizing our administrative rules, transitioning to paperless processes and electronic records, ensuring legal access to all our school lands, cost-saving measures regarding land appraisals, obtaining the remaining lands owed to the state from the federal government, and investigating opportunities to create new revenues from environmental markets. Next slide, please. Here are a few more examples. There are 2 action areas specific to forest lands. In the land classification section, we discuss forest lands managed by Oregon Department of Forestry and forest lands managed by the Department of State Lands. One action area involves a legal process called decertification, which is to have the Oregon Department of Forestry return management control on those forest lands back to DSL. This change has been shown to save the department management cost on those forest lands with lower productivity. During the past couple of years, we've worked with Oregon Department of Forestry to decertify our forest lands in the Klamath area, for example. The second forest land action area is increasing active management of our projects on our DSL managed forest lands. And for example, last year, DSL sold its first timber sale, which will generate over $650,000 from forest lands in Hood River County. The program expects revenue from these DSL managed forest lands to continue to increase in future years. And by the way, this slide shows our new branding hammer for stamping logs on our in-house timber projects. Next slide, please. All right, as I've stated, a key focus of this asset management plan has been to improve annual revenue, and renewable energy development is rapidly increasing industry in which, under the right circumstances, will fit well with school lands management. We currently have 3 sites leased to companies exploring solar development on department lands. The earliest project is on track for completion by 2026. And the Real Property Program is working on an analysis document to further identify and evaluate renewable energy development potential across all school lands. Right, next slide, please. So we really value our partnerships. Seeking partnerships is perhaps the most important action area in the plan. These partnerships provide funding from grants that would otherwise not be available to the state. These partnerships have mutually benefited goals of conservation and other land improvement efforts tackling a variety of projects. We work with many partners. These include soil and water conservation districts, watershed councils, cooperative weed management areas, tribes, various nonprofits such as Pheasants Forever and High Desert Partnership, state agencies such as the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Forestry, and federal agencies such as U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Again, this is just a few examples of our action areas. Please review the plan as these action areas discuss much more detail than I covered here. All right, next slide, please. In our measuring success portion of the plan, we review how we look at management performance. We discuss moving away from return on asset value as a performance indicator, starting with the 2025 annual report. Return on asset value relies on real market value appraisals on all our school lands to evaluate performance. Keeping up to date with real market value appraisals for all our lands is expensive and subject to various market conditions. However, we are continuing to use our other performance indicators, and they are annual revenue, which is our gross income from the properties, and net operating income, which is annual revenue minus our annual operating expenses. These measures are calculated for each land classification and summarized program-wide. Our annual reports, which are presented to the land board every year, track annual revenues and net operating incomes for the past 3 years. Our recent 2023 annual report is available on our website. Next slide, please. At the end of measuring success section, we pivot from monetary benefits to look at community benefits, and these outcomes from school land management include meeting community needs such as residential housing in our ICR, or industrial, commercial, and residential land planning, reducing wildfire risk on our school lands by treating fuels which protect surrounding lands and communities, supporting local economies with working landscapes, and continuing environmental justice communities. And considering environmental justice communities through our actions. These communities include remote and rural communities, tribal communities, coastal communities, communities of color, or those with limited infrastructure, and other communities that are traditionally underrepresented in the public processes. So this was a very brief overview. I encourage you to read through the document. The plan also has appendices that cover other department land classifications, other department plans, planning timeline, the planning timeline and process for this asset management plan, and the land acquisition guidelines and evaluation criteria. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to Kate. Oh, next slide, yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Amber, if you could move on to the next slide. You can see Brian's email address there, but I'll also copy it into the chat just so you can have that easily available. Now we have time for a few questions. If you have a question, you could either raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button, or you can use the Q&A function as part of Zoom. So whichever you feel most comfortable. Yeah, so we'll just give it a minute and see if any folks have any questions.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
Steve.
Steve Hurley with Redmond Economic Development. Just curious, why did they move away from the return on asset valuation that you had talked about?
I can answer that if you'd like.
Sure.
Yeah. So the return on asset value required, like Brian said, analyzing the value of our properties every year. And when we did return on asset value, we were comparing the income that we made to the value of the property. And so that number doesn't really represent the long-term benefits of our land management. And the number doesn't go up unless the land value significantly goes down, or the rates that we charge for uses of state land significantly go up. So it was a number that really isn't representative of good land management activities. And it really just isn't a good fit for the long-term land management intent of school lands.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you, Steve, for that question. Do we have any other questions before we move on to the public hearing portion? And if you have a question after today, you can always email Brian and we can get that answered. So today is not your only chance. Great. Well, I'm going to, if you could click the next slide, Amber. Thank you. Now is time for the public hearing portion of today's meeting. Again, you can use that raise hand function or, turn your camera on, and either way, whichever feels easier for you. We'll be accepting spoken public comment on today's the proposed 10-year land management plan in today's meeting. But before we get to that, I just wanted a reminder that we are accepting written comments through April 3rd. And again, you can see those guidelines on the screen via email, an online form, or via mail. All right, and if you could click the next slide. Thank you. The spoken comment guidelines, again, use the raise hand function. And when it's your turn to speak, if you could just say your name, where you're from, and what organization you're representing. And we're hoping to keep remarks to 3 minutes today. And I will help keep track of your time. With that, does anyone want to submit a spoken comment at today's public hearing portion? All right, I think sounds like we are maybe perhaps wrapped up with the spoken comment portion of today's public hearing. Seeing no other hands being raised. Oh, a note from Emily. Thank you, Emily. We look forward to please seeing your written comment. Seeing no other hands, I hereby close the public hearing on the proposed asset management plan for the Department of State Lands. And I'm going to put the link in the chat for right now for accessing the project page. 1 second, y'all. Let's make sure I get that pulled up. And that is where you can find also contact information for Brian, the comment form, and I think that's it. So please reach out if you have any follow-up questions, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us today.